Well, as I expected, I was not able to convince many people that Pythagoras's discovery was really strange. I don't think I convinced many people of that because math seems so obvious and it's just what we all take for granted. But here's what I think, or here's how I think about it. I've always loved science fiction, and uh, I started to read less of it when I discovered actual science because the universe is actually a lot weirder than science fiction. And I enjoy the weirdness. So if you think about the age of the universe is say 13 and a half billion years, and then 4.5 billion years ago, we started this planet. And then soon thereafter, maybe within a billion years for sure, probably less than that, life evolved for some reason that we don't understand. Life evolved. And then 4 billion years went by, and one of the critters, from the worms and the salamanders and so forth, one of the critters that evolved started to have visions in his head. And those visions, it turns out, reflected the fundamental structure of the universe. Now, that seems very peculiar to me, and it's weirder than any science fiction story I can think of. So I do believe it's very strange, and I do believe that Plato and Einstein were onto something. Now, just to catch up where we were last time, we were on Heraclitus. Heraclitus was the guy who thought everything changes all the time. And remember, we just have fragments of what they thought. The other thought that I didn't discuss about Heraclitus is his unity of the opposites. And those are, for the Greeks, it was like the wet and the dry, the hot and the cold, the male and the female. These opposites were interesting to at least Heraclitus. I don't know if these interesting to everybody else, but to him for sure. And it inspired some things later on, namely Hegel and Hegel and Heidegger. And also, we can relate it to the I Ching, to Taoism and the yin yang of Taoism. And I also mentioned last time we have no evidence that there was any communication between China or India and the Greeks. We have no evidence whatsoever, even though it seems like there must have been. We have no evidence of that. I don't know what to say about this unity of the opposites. To me, it seems like a really fertile idea, but on the other hand, the opposites they mention aren't really opposite. The wet is not opposite to the dry, it's a continuum. And the hot is not opposite to the cold, it's a continuum. It's only from the subjective perspective of an individual that they seem hot and cold and wet and dry, from the human perspective, perhaps. But in reality, hot goes all the way from the surface of the sun down to a hot day in San Rafael, and cold goes all the way down to absolute zero. And I don't think they're opposites. It's just it doesn't strike me as a fair representation, especially if we're going to use that representation as some kind of fundamental structure in the universe to help us understand what reality is. Now, you can pick anything you want and believe it, and I'm going to talk about this more when we get to Christianity, but the human mind is very, very adept, once it accepts an idea, in conforming all the rest of its ideas so that they all match and they all make sense. We're very good at this, and that isn't a good habit, as I think we see with the current presidency. You just decide that is true, and then everything has to conform to that to make your worldview be comfortable. Nothing can oppose that. So I'm skeptical, and a little bit wary of any kind of system that allows you to, a simple system in particular, that allows you to understand the universe. Okay. Now, I want to move on to the sophists. As I said, the uh, pre-Socratics are from all over the Greek Empire, and it's the Greeks are not an empire, but it's part of the Greek culture that spans all, well, it's all the way from like Italy to Turkey, and they all spoke the Greek language and shared the same culture, but it wasn't an empire in the sense the Romans were. It wasn't governed by anything central. So the pre-Socratics came from all over, as did the Sophists, and the Sophists were a group of traveling teachers, and they would educate the sons, it would be the sons of the upper classes. And so you'd go pay to see somebody like Gorgias and Hippias and Thrasymachus and Protagoras. You'd see them talk and they would educate you. And the goal of their education was more like a Tony Robbins kind of thing. It was success. They would give you the tools for success. Like, for example, Gorgias taught rhetoric. So the idea was, as you know, in Athens, it was a direct democracy. If you wanted to have any influence in the assembly or the ecclesia, which was their governing body, you had to be able to speak and be convincing. And so it was a useful skill to learn how to speak and present your case. There's a famous Plato has a lot of dialogues that are dialogues specifically with the famous sophists. And in the dialogue to Gorgias, I think it's that one. Socrates argues that the most persuasive argument is the one that's true. It's not, it has nothing to do with how you present it. I don't know if it's nothing to do, but it's not going to be fundamentally persuasive because of your tone of voice or your rhetoric. It's going to be persuasive because it's true. That's the Socratic argument, which is pretty funny. Okay, so one of the famous sophists was Protagoras, and there is a philosophical, a dialogue, a Platonic dialogue on of Protagoras. And Protagoras had a demonstration, and this goes to what I was just talking about the hot and the cold and the wet and the dry. So Protagoras would demonstrate, he would give his presentation, and he would have somebody come up from the audience, and two guys, and he would have 3 bowls of water. One would be really hot, almost to the boiling point. One would be really, really cold. And then a lukewarm one would be in the middle. And he'd ask them, one guy to put his hand in the hot water, one guy to put his hand in the cold water. And then after a minute or so, he'd have them both switch to the lukewarm water. And of course, the guy who had his hand in the hot water said it felt cold to him. And the guy who had his hand in the cold water said it felt hot to him. Ergo, says Protagoras, it's all in the beholder. There is no absolute truth. It is just all your subjective opinion on what is true. And that is called relativism, and it was the position of most of the sophists, and is not the position of Plato. But interestingly enough, it's one of the fundamental ideas of democracy is that everybody's vote counts the same, no matter how stupid or smart you are. You all get an equal vote. In other words, it all counts the same, as if it all has the same merit. And then it's also kind of part of the liberal mindset that we should honor everybody's point of view. And if a cultural point of view is different from ours, we should respect it anyway. I think there's a limit to that. If you want to be a Nazi, I'm not going to extend my respect for your point of view beyond a certain point. I'm going to have limits. And so the question will be in philosophy, where is that limit? Where is the limit between something that's totally a matter of opinion? Like, for instance, I might say Justin Bieber is a better singer than Ray Charles. That's a matter of opinion. I think everybody would agree it's a matter of opinion. But when you come to math, it doesn't seem to be a matter of opinion that 2 plus 2 equals 4. And I would not know what to say if somebody said that's not true. I would not know how to continue the conversation. So where is the line between things that we know to be true, like arithmetic, and things that are just a matter of opinion, which is would be your favorite singer? So that's one of the goals of philosophy, is to try to discriminate between those two things, subjective and objective truths. Now, when we come to Plato, we're going to talk about Socrates first. I want to just give you an outline of his personality and existence. But our only source for, or no, not our only source, our main source for Socrates is Plato. And Plato was a student of Socrates. He was born in 427. Socrates was born in 469. I'll get back to that in a minute. So Socrates is rather an old man by the time that Plato starts to, like, he'd be a teenager, and Socrates would be kind of an old man when he starts to study with Socrates, his mentor. Now, there's two other guys that write about Socrates. Unlike Jesus, we have three main sources, and actually more, to confirm the existence of Socrates. He's not a fictional character. Another prominent guy was Xenophanes, who was a student of Socrates that went on to become a general. And another guy was Aristophanes, the comic playwright, who also talks about Socrates. So there's no doubt that Socrates existed and was a prominent, well-known character in ancient Athens. Just a couple of remarks. I'll get into this further. A couple of remarks on Plato's style of writing. Now, Plato, we've been talking about guys like who we just have fragments of, and I mentioned like an archaeological dig, and you got this shard and that shard and a bone or something, and then you're trying to piece together what they're talking about. It'd be as if you were doing that archaeological dig, and all of a sudden you found an iPhone. That's the difference between Plato and everything that went before him. Because Plato is, I don't think there's much, I'm not saying anything weird to say that Plato is recognized as one of the most brilliant guys of all time. Now, you tend to think, well, he's an old guy. We've already done all this stuff. It's not that interesting. Everything's been superseded, that he said. This is just not the case. He's just a very weird writer and very, very difficult to understand because he seems so easy to understand. At first, you think, well, what's this little dialogue about? This is silly. This doesn't amount to anything. And that's, as a matter of fact, what Wittgenstein thought. Wittgenstein, one of the great philosophers of the 20th century, he goes, what are these all about? He didn't read Plato very much, I suspect. And then it was my reaction too. For at least 10 years of reading Plato, I thought, this is, so what? Is silly little naive dialogues. I just want to say a couple of things about the way he writes. Number one, he writes in a dialogue form, and the dialogues are, the star of the dialogues is always Socrates. Plato claimed that he would never, and never has and never would, write a treatise on what his thoughts were on anything. Everything he wrote, he said, is just Socrates rejuvenated and beautified. That's a little pretentious, but on the other hand, Socrates, what that comes from, I think, the second letter. We do have some letters that Plato writes in his own voice. The rest of it are all of his writings are dialogues. And that letter may not be legit. We don't know. Some of the letters are argued over, but that is what he did. He just wrote dialogues with Socrates being the star. And I want you to think about how weird that is for an intellectual that was a giant and recognized as such in his day to write everything and claim that it wasn't his idea, it was only his teacher's idea, and put everything in the mouth of his teacher. Imagine you doing that as a scholar and a great creator. You say, well, I didn't write this. This is all from Socrates. Now, nobody believes it's all from Socrates, and I'll get to that in a second. But it's a very weird thing to do. I would suggest, I can't think of another guy to do. The only guy I can think of is Samuel Pepys. The no, Boswell, Life of Johnson. He's the only guy I could think of that did anything like that, and he's self-consciously writing.
Maybe St. Paul.
Who? St. Paul. That's a good call. Of course, St. Paul never knew Jesus, whereas Plato definitely knew Socrates. But that's a good call. I like that one. And certainly, St. Paul would have classed himself as less of a figure than Jesus, of course. Anyway, so Socrates, one of the weird things is he writes in these dialogues. The second weird thing is that the dialogues are separated by scholars into, of course, this isn't definite, but into three periods: the early, middle, and late. And the early dialogues are thought to actually reflect the style of Socrates. The middle dialogues are thought to reflect the style, but added into them is a bunch of ideas that may be completely original with Plato, but I think he presents them as not being original with him, but being extensions, perhaps, of what Socrates believed. And then in the later dialogues, he kind of becomes very didactic. And so the interlocutor, which is what the tradition calls the other guy that Socrates is talking to, the interlocutor, he becomes kind of a yes man. Like Socrates will say stuff and the guy will say, yes, I agree. I mean, he's not really interacting fundamentally as he does as the interlocutor does, who's in the early and middle dialogues. Another thing to know is that most of the figures in the Platonic dialogues are actual historical characters that people reading the dialogues at the time would have been familiar with. Now, that's not true of a couple that we're going to talk about, namely Euthyphro and Diotima, and we'll get to those. We don't know who they were, but most of them are well known. Like in the Laches, we have Laches and Nicias, who are very famous generals, and so Socrates talks to them about courage, like going to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and asking them about courage. So, okay, we have the dialogue form. In the early dialogues, they often end in confusion. So what you think's going to happen is that somebody asks a question like, what is justice? And then they talk about it for a while, and Socrates keeps asking questions. And I always, in my classes, used to be able to refer to Columbo, but I can't. In the last 15 years, I can't do that because nobody knows who that is. But Columbo, I can't believe the guys who wrote Columbo didn't read the Socratic dialogues, because it's this humble guy, and he starts up by saying, Columbo always knows who the perpetrator is. He goes right to their house. There's been a crime, and he asks them, like, yeah, this is, I don't know how this happened, and the perpetrator will often offer an explanation that exonerates him. Here's how it happened. And Socrates will say, not Socrates, Columbo will say, oh yeah, I'm sure that's a perfect, I didn't think of that, but that's a brilliant idea. Yeah, I got to think about that. And they'll be walking out the door and he'll say, oh, but one thing confuses me a little bit. That is just exactly what Socrates does. He'll ask a question like, what is justice? And somebody will say, oh, Socrates, everybody knows what that is, and they'll give an answer. And then Socrates will compliment them on how great their answer is. And then he'll say, but just straighten this out for me, will you? And and from that point on, the other guy is toast. He's going to be confused, and that's it's. I find this very amusing, but philosophy is not supposed to be funny. But I find a lot of things about it hilarious, and Socrates is one of them. We'll get to that when we go to the youth pro. Anyway, so let me get back to Socrates himself. He Let me step back a second in the history. The first this we learn this stuff from Herodotus, and Herodotus is a good read, by the way, believe it or not. He's the first historian and not uninteresting. Herodotus is a little bit credulous as a historian by today's standards. Like if he goes someplace and he'll meet the people and ask them stuff, and if they say, well, if you go over to this village, there'll be dragons there, Herodotus will just write that down. He won't say the people think there's dragons there. He will say, if you go to that village, there are dragons. He just believes what they tell him. It's kind of hilarious. But anyway, Herodotus is a good read. So Herodotus is a guy who reports on the Persian Wars. And there were two major Persian Wars. First one in 490, and that was started by Darius, the king of Persia. And you'll recently there was a movie called The 300, and that was about the defeat of the Persians at Marathon. And that kind of ended it's just unbelievable that Persians were this superpower, like the United States invading Vietnam. It was like that level of this little dinky bunch of disorganized city states, and yet Persia was twice defeated in their attempt to bring them to heel. So the first one was a battle of Marathon, where the Spartans died to the last man at Marathon, and it just so happened that that kind of ended that battle. And so that was Darius, the king, and he retreats and goes back to Persia. And then 10 years later, his son Xerxes tries to go back. It's kind of like Bush Jr. trying to go back to Iraq after Bush Sr. didn't conquer Iraq. So Bush Jr. is going to get it done, right? So Xerxes comes to Greece, and he's going to, conquer all the Greeks for a variety of reasons. But anyway, what ends up happening there is that there's a battle in the Gulf of Salamis, which is there's an island right off of Piraeus. Piraeus is the port of Athens. Athens itself is a little inland and up on the hill a bit. And this is right at the port is Piraeus, and right across the strait, not very far. It's like probably as far as it's farther from Piraeus than Angel Island is from Tiburon, but it may not be as far as Berkeley is from Angel Island. It's a fairly narrow Gulf of Salamis, and it's a long and fabulous story about how the Greeks beat the Persians at Salamis. It's complicated and really fabulous. It's the first naval battle we know of in history that we have documented, and one of the most important because, okay, that happened in 480 BC. The Persians are defeated once again. And in the next century, the Athenians, Athens, what happens is Athens rises in prominence, and they they are the dominant Greek city then for another 100 years, along with Sparta. And Sparta is a completely different kind of community. But in the next 100 years or so, Athens invents democracy, invents theater. They produce Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, Pericles, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. That's just the A-list. I've left off about 15 people. All of the most famous guys you ever heard of from ancient Greece were produced in the next 100 years. And it's interesting to contemplate what would have happened if they lost the Battle of Salamis. Would we have ever had Plato and Aristotle? So I think it's not uncommon to rate that battle of Salamis with the top in the top 5 battles of all time in terms of influence on Western history, up there with Trafalgar and Midway and a couple other battles, Waterloo. Those things really affected, they were turning points in history. And if had they gone another direction, we'd probably be a different culture at this point. Anyway, so Socrates is born 11 years after the second defeat at Salamis in 469. So little baby Socrates is born. And there's only one image that we always have of Socrates. He's like this pudgy, bald guy with long hair and a pug nose. That's the only image we have of him. It's probably not accurate, but one of the things I like to remind people of is that, Darwin, we see with a long beard, and all these guys with a long beard, they weren't in the prime of their lives when these portraits were taken. It's like they'd become revered revered characters, and now they're old men, and so they get their portrait taken. Socrates was a young man when he was doing most of this stuff, or at least middle age. And same with Darwin. When Darwin went around the world and did the Beagle thing, he was like in his 20s, and he had a lot of courage. Darwin did, physical courage, and so did Socrates. So when Socrates was about 40, in that late 30s, early 40s, he fought in 3 battles, and by all accounts was courageous and completely indifferent to pain and discomfort and danger. He was I don't know if hero might be too strong of a word, but certainly not a wilting violent when it came to battle. He would stand in there and do, and he supposedly rescued a general named Alcibiades, who we'll get to in the symposium. So I just like to remind you that Socrates in his life wasn't that old fuddy-duddy, guy. He that avuncular guy. There's even videos of Socrates where they have some actor, and Socrates is this old avuncular sweetheart. That doesn't ring true to me. Maybe he was avuncular, but he wasn't old when he was doing all this stuff. Anyway, Socrates was what happened at the end of his life, and there's 4 dialogues that describe the last period of Socrates' life: the Euthyphro, the Credo, the Euthyphro, the Apology, the Credo, and the Phaedo. So in the Euthyphro, what happens is, and this is one of the dialogues we're actually going to look at in depth, the Euthyphro. And this is one of those dialogues where we don't know who Euthyphro was. Most of the people in the dialogues, we know who they were. We don't know who Euthyphro was. It's a very weird story. Euthyphro is prosecuting his father for murder, which is not the way it worked in ancient Greece. The family of the victim would prosecute the perpetrator. And here Euthyphro is prosecuting his father, who's the murderer, for murdering something and somebody. And the guy he murdered, it isn't even a murder. It's more like, at worst, negligent homicide. At worst. It's or negligent manslaughter. It's just not it doesn't rise to the level of first-degree murder for sure. And he's prosecuting his father. So he meets Socrates on the porch of the King Archon, and this would be the equivalent of our indictment hearing. And the King Archon is where you bring these charges. And so Euthyphro's going up to the King Archon, and he meets Socrates. And Socrates has been accused of impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens. And so Socrates runs into Euthyphro, and he says, "What are you here for, Euthyphro?" And he says, he tells him, "I'm prosecuting my father for," and Socrates is astonished, because that's just not the way things are done in Greece. You don't prosecute your father. The family should be prosecuting his father, if anyone. even if there's a crime. So Socrates is amazing. And what he says to Euthyphro is, you must really understand what piety and the law are, because what you're doing is so outrageous. And he uses the phrase, you must be quite far gone in wisdom. I love this. I always think of McAtee as being quite far gone in wisdom in every way. So anyway, uh, Socrates implores Euthyphro to instruct him on piety so that he can use his wisdom to defend himself in court. That's how it starts. So you have to tell me, I'm begging you to tell me what your understanding of piety is, so I can use your wisdom to defend myself, because I'm charged with impiety. Anyway, so that we'll take a stronger look at the dialogue, which is very interesting. Then the next dialogue, in the next few days, what happens is we have Socrates' trial, the apology. And in that trial, I would liken it to the trial of the Chicago Seven. Socrates does not, what would be expected in the apology in Greece is that, look, he's been charged with impiety and corrupting the youth. These are not capital charges. They're not generally going to get you executed. What is thought is there was three guys, Lycon, Miletus, and Anytus, who were, we think, political enemies of Socrates for one reason or another, and also wanted to make a name for themselves. And they probably wanted, I mean, it was a contentious period because, okay, just stepping back, the Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens had started in 427 and ended in 404. And what happened was an oligarchy was in place in Athens by the Spartans to rule. And they were called the 30 tyrants. And the 30 tyrants were only there for a year, and then the democracy was reinstated. But during that time, a lot of unpleasant stuff happened. And there was some retributions. I think there were retributions from the 30 tyrants and also from the democracy once it was reinstated. But anyway, Socrates knew and had some students that were among the 30 tyrants. And so I.F. Stone, a while back, wrote a book on Socrates, accusing him of being kind of in cahoots with the 30 tyrants, which is out to lunch. I mean, I.F. Stone, he's a muckraking guy who I generally appreciate, but I think he's off the mark in this book about Socrates. And anyway, it is the case that it was probably a political trial, and the intent was to humiliate Socrates, not to have him executed. That's what the general consensus is. So what you would do if this had been you and you'd been accused of impiety and corrupting youth, you'd show up with your family and you'd throw yourself before the mercy of the court and say, look, I didn't mean to cross a line here, and I see I have, so I apologize. That's what was intended to happen. But Socrates doesn't go for that at all. He argues more or less that he's done, by his activities, he's done a favor to the people of Athens. And he's not guilty of any crime. And you can read the apology, maybe you have. And this is not set well with the jury. The jury's made up of about 500 people. The ecclesia, the assembled ecclesia is 500 people. And so just like we have nowadays, there was a guilt phase and a sentencing phase. Meredith here is an actual lawyer, so we could ask her about the particulars, but you didn't have lawyers in Athens. You had to speak for yourself, which is another reason why you wanted to study under Gorgias and learn how to speak. Anyway, this doesn't go down well with the jury, and they convict him of these charges. And the conviction isn't overwhelming. It's like if there's 500 people, it's like 255 to 245. It's a pretty close judgment. But anyway, he's convicted. So then, after you get convicted, there's a sentencing phase. So you're allowed to suggest uh, uh, a punishment, right? So Socrates says, this is in the Apology. Plato was at the trial, by the way. Socrates says, I think I should be fed for life in the Prytaneum, which is what you get if you're an Olympic champion. It's not, it's not any kind of punishment. It's like I should get a gold medal. And of course, this also doesn't go down well with the jury. He's not taking this seriously and with enough gravitas to suit them and humility. And so then he says, okay, well, I think I can scrounge up a fine, and because he could, he had rich friends. And or among his, I shouldn't say he had rich friends. Among his friends were rich people. Anyway, so no, the jury is very offended by his suggestion he should be treated like an Olympic champion, and they say no, you're going to get the death penalty. So the way that worked was in Greece, when you were convicted of a capital crime, you were executed that night at sundown. There was no, appeals or any of that. That didn't happen. You were just convicted and you were executed that night at sundown. However, the day that he was convicted began a holy holiday in Athens because every year a boat would go to Delos, which is the sacred island, the birthplace of Apollo and Artemis. And a boat of dignitaries and priests would take a trip to Delos and offer prayers and celebrations and libations to Apollo to pay an old debt, is how Xenophon, I think, writes it up. And we don't know what time of year it was, but I think Apollo's birthday's in the spring, so it's probably springtime. But anyway, while the boat is gone, that for that whole period of time, there are no executions. It's like, I don't think we execute people on Christmas. I'd kind of be surprised to find that we do. So it'd be like that, it's a holy time, and so nobody gets executed. So Socrates gets a stay of execution. He doesn't get executed that day. So he spends about 30 days in the Huskow. And during this time, some other stuff happens. I have my theory. I have some theories that are just conjectures about why it took so long. 30 days is a long time. Delos is only 90 miles as the crow flies from Athens. So that's like, at best, 2 days sailing. It's not going to take you 2 weeks each way to get there. And I can't believe that the ceremony lasted a month. But anyway, my conjecture is that there were people on board that knew, including the captain and priests, that knew Socrates would be executed the day they got back. And so they drug their heels getting back. But that's just I don't have any evidence for that whatsoever. Anyway, so during this period of time, we have another dialogue. So far we've got the Euthyphro and the Credo. Euthyphro and the Apology. Now another dialogue is the Credo. And in the Credo is a very wealthy friend of Socrates, and he goes down to the prison and he says, Socrates, all of us, your friends and family, are devastated by this verdict, which is obviously nonsense and it's trumped up charges. So it would be no problem for me at all to bribe the guards, get you out of here, and I'll set you up in a house in Thessaly and you can live out your life. And there's no need for you to be executed. We would be horrified if this actual sentence was carried out. And Socrates says, nah, I'm not going for that. It would be essentially ignoble. And one of the arguments he uses is, I have been protected by the laws of Athens for my whole life, And now that the laws have turned against me, it would be improper of me to show my gratitude by slapping them in the face and turning my back on the laws that have provided me with such a good life. That's the argument. So that's the credo. We're not going to read that. And then the final day comes. What happens is Credo sends a runner up to Cape Sunion, which has a temple up there, and you can overlook the Gulf of the Saronic Gulf, which is the route from Delos back to Athens, and you can see the ship coming back. So the idea was, Credo sends a runner up there to see the ship coming in. And then as soon as the runner sees that, he runs back to Athens and tells everybody that Socrates is going to be executed that night. And at that point, all of Socrates' friends assemble in the prison, in Socrates' prison cell. And the last day is spent, Socrates insists that they spend the day debating things, just like he always does. We're gonna have an argument, and the argument's going to be about whether my soul is eternal. In other words, at sundown tonight, am I going to actually die? Is that the end of everything, or is my soul going to go to another place, and I'm going to be able to meet all the great heroes of the past? And so, uncharacteristically, Socrates takes the answer part. In other words, he reverses the roles of his conversationalists and himself. He says, yes, I think my soul's going to be eternal and I'm going to survive. And he challenges them to prove him wrong. So now imagine yourself, you're one of your best friends that you admire very much is going to be executed that night at 6 o'clock or sundown, and he makes you argue that is going to be the end of his life and he's never going to have another moment of consciousness. He makes you take that side of the argument. And so anyway, the argument proceeds and we hear about it. And then what happens is the executioner comes in and gives him the glass or the cup of hemlock, and Socrates drinks it and dies. I have pictures of the hemlock. So for some reason, they have in the Agora Museum in Athens, they have ancient cups that were used for this purpose that hold the hemlock, and I've got a picture of it. But these have been preserved since ancient times, so we actually have them, and I'll probably show you those next time. Anyway, that's as far as I'm going to get today. Any questions or comments? We got kind of a smaller group today, but that doesn't mean we're not mighty. So any questions, comments, follow-ups? Well, I don't hear anything. So
I have something to say. It's a little indirect. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hey, yeah,
Okay.
Peter.
I once wrote a paper that involved Socrates' arguments for immortality in the Phaedo, and my attitude when I started the paper is it should be easy to refute these. And I found that it was virtually impossible to refute them unless you don't accept his premise, which is that the soul is essentially alive, and the idea that the soul could die is like almost a logical contradiction. Once you accept that premise, you're kind of stuck, you know? And I think he does take that as a premise.
He does, but I think your first intuition is correct. That is that I think his arguments are a bit thin, proving
I do too, but I had trouble dealing with them.
Uh-huh. There's a better argument that we're gonna find in the Meno for the soul's immortality, and we're gonna get to that. But I think the arguments that are presented in the Phaedo are not strong. But just that's one of the really amazing things about Plato is he will let Socrates The most amazing dialogue, well, one of the most amazing dialogues is the Parmenides, which we're not going to, it's fairly difficult, but we're not going to talk about that. And in the Parmenides, uh, Socrates presents Plato's core theory, which is the theory of forms. And we'll get to all this stuff. But what happens is Parmenides refutes it. He says, no, this can't, and he produces a famous argument that contradicts or refutes the theory of forms. And Socrates doesn't have a response. Now, think about that. You have your main character present your core theory. Then you have somebody else come in and say, nah, that's not going to work. And then you don't rebut it. You don't have a response. You just let it lie there. This is Plato just being such a weirdo and it's such a genius at this stuff. So anyway, getting back to your point about the argument, I don't think the arguments in the Phaedo are very strong, but it's a very dramatic scene, obviously. And it was painted by David, or is it David, you guys? There's a very famous painting about Socrates and all his friends drinking as he drinks the hemlock. For some reason, Plato wasn't there on his last day. He wasn't there, but he was there at the trial. Any other comments?
I wanted to say something about the jury system and why it is that it persists to this day, which it does not exactly in many of our European counterpart countries. It doesn't exist in the sense that we have it in Germany, for example. The jury system finds the truth in a way that almost nothing else does. Certainly, I think Trump is beginning to find out that the jury of the whole of this country is not going to agree with his preconceived notions. And he is going to go down because of that, in my view. The way Bill Clinton was certainly excoriated by his prosecutor, but the jury of the country decided they wanted to keep him as president anyway. And that is what happened. I think sometimes people think about the jury system as being, a collection of people who are probably not the most educated often, or the most the same class that you would expect, say, the judge or the lawyers to be. But when it comes to wisdom, there's a theory about the wisdom of crowds that surpasses what lawyers and judges can come up with. Is something that I think is really important and goes back a very long way. And so if the jury of the people felt that Socrates should be excused for whatever it was that he was found guilty of, and I don't think I even followed what it was he was guilty of, probably if they'd been given the final say, Socrates would not have been drinking the hemlock.
Well, remember what Socrates did. His defense was not something that appealed to them. And in other words, I think most people think he could easily have gotten off if he wasn't so obnoxious. Now, I call him obnoxious. I think he's a sweetheart. I'm very fond of Socrates, but he wasn't having it. He just wasn't going to buckle down and say, I'm sorry, and I know I crossed the line, and he wasn't going to do that. And there were certain members of the jury, and that's not hard to believe, that took umbrage at that, thought he should be kissing the ring and not being so bold. And then to have the audacity to say he ought to be treated like an Olympic champion after he'd been convicted. I mean, You would, Meredith, you would not. Well, you go before judges, right? Not juries. Am I correct?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. But if you were doing a jury trial and your client had been convicted, and then you said, okay, well, he's convicted, but I think he should be given a gold medal anyway. How do you think that would go over with the jury?
Not well.
No, well, you know, the jury would disregard me for sure in that circumstance.
Well, that's what Socrates did. And it didn't work out for him, but
Well, yeah, but he could foresee that, right? I mean,
yeah, I
yeah,
think so.
and the question is, where did he want this to end up? Right? Isn't that, aren't you, when you watch this in action, you sense, huh, you know, I could easily pay the ticket and walk out the door, but I'm not having it. I'm standing on principle
Yeah.
and so on. But I know the principle is that's going to put me, it's going to have the bad ending. Or was he intending to get there?
Well, I don't that of course is impossible to say, but it's the same thing with he could have gotten out of it. He had another out, which is Credo busting him out of jail. That was a viable thing. That's not a made up thing. Credo was really rich and important, and he could have. This is doable. He could have bribed the guards and gotten him out of there to Thessaly, set him up for life. There was not a problem for Credo, and he says so. So there were many avenues Socrates had to avoid being being executed.
So, Tony, are you saying that Socrates probably wanted to be executed?
No, I don't think he wanted to be executed, but he also didn't want to break his. He has Socrates had a famous. One of the things he's being prosecuted for, his impiety. The impiety was based on the notion that Socrates famously had what he called a demon, but you could just call a little voice in your head. And the demon would only tell him when he was about to do something that was not right. And he says that coming to the court today and making this argument, the demon never said that I shouldn't do what I was doing. In other words, he never had a little voice in his head saying, Socrates, this ain't right. He just stuck to what he knew. Well, this is how he's presented by Plato. But we think, by the way, these are these are really early dialogues that I'm describing. The Apology may have been the first dialogue Plato wrote, and the Euthyphro is also an early dialogue. Plato saw all this stuff. He saw the trial happen, and when he saw the trial happen, he hadn't turned 20 yet. He was a teenager at Socrates' trial, and certainly Socrates was a hero. There's no question Socrates was a hero to him, and he wanted to portray him in a heroic light. However, one thing that lends credence to his account of things is that this was all very well known. Like Xenophon, who also was a student of Socrates, doesn't dispute anything. Most of the things that Plato says are not disputed by anyone else. And since he was dealing with very public matters, with very public people, I think that the only guy to come along to dispute this is I.F. Stone, and he wasn't there. So I.F. Stone just kind of slants everything as though he wasn't a believer in democracy, which he wasn't, by the way. But we don't know what Socrates believed. Plato, we'll get to the Republic, but in the Republic, I remember when I first read it, I thought, they're having me read this guy who doesn't believe in democracy. I couldn't believe I was being told to read the Republic. But bear in mind that Plato saw his beloved mentor executed by the democracy. And he doesn't, that the republic is an ideal. It isn't something Plato suggests. In fact, I'll have the quote later, but he says that such a society has never existed and probably never will exist. It's just an ideal society he sets up. I'll talk about it more later, but the his portrayal of Socrates is just too public. I can't see how Plato would have the front to tell a bunch of lies about Socrates when it was all so public. It was like doing this in the New York Times of the day, because many of these people were still alive that he talks about, and the ones that weren't alive, everybody knew who they were. I don't know. That was a long answer to that, but
this makes me think of the moment when Julius Caesar goes to the Senate after having been told by a seer that he shouldn't go, and been told by his wife, even more importantly, that he shouldn't go. But he goes anyway, and he doesn't anticipate that his closest associates in Rome, who believe in democracy, think that he's willing to accept the crown from the people by acclamation, because he's been too hesitant in refusing it when they've tried to give it to him. So they think that their republic is going to falter and die if Caesar accepts the crown.
Boy, this is
and so they kill him.
That's a topical story. That one thing about Socrates is that we don't have stories like that. We don't have a Judas among his crowd that betrays him. In Socrates,
well, the people who killed Caesar were not Judases.
Well,
they were believers. They thought patriots. They were patriots.
Yeah, but they killed him, which would be considered a betrayal by some people.
But only because they thought that he was going to. They thought he was Hitler. They thought he was going to take down their society.
Well, yeah, but what I mean is nobody thought that about Socrates. We don't have any record of any people in Socrates' inner group that thought that he was out of line. The only people that thought he was out of line were his accusers from, we believe, kind of another, they had ulterior motives for trying to humiliate him. Well, that's what we think. We don't know. You can't recreate that.
But he's accepting it, Socrates.
Yeah, because he thinks it's ignoble to try to run away from
it. Could I make a couple of quick comments on comments?
Of course.
I found I.F. Stone's book, The Trial of Socrates, deeply disappointing, even though I have great admiration for I.F. Stone and once met him. It's basically guilt by association. He leans very heavily on the likelihood that Socrates not only disapproved of Athenian democracy, admired Sparta, but that he associated with men who had been in the 30 Tyrants. And that's true, but you would think that Stone, of all people, would not want someone condemned to death on guilt by association. And, in my opinion, the charges were bogus, could be seen at the time as bogus, and Socrates was a great man for not backing down. The other thing is about juries. Like Meredith, I really believe in juries. But one thing that makes a jury different from a crowd is that with a jury, the men and women are of a limited number and they talk to each other before deciding. Crowds don't always do that. Nations don't always do that, which is one reason why they can be misled, I think, more easily than juries. But of all people, Machiavelli says in The Prince, the people are always more moral than their rulers. That's true.
Well, Peter, I agree with everything you said about Stone, and I'm an admirer of his too, but I think he got this one wrong. And one little detail of the apology that kind of contradicts Stone's point is that Charmides, you know the story about Charmides? I think I mentioned it when I was talking about the Oracle at Delphi. Charmides is one of the guys, friend of Socrates, that goes to the Oracle at Delphi, who tells him that no one is wiser than Socrates. That's a guy named Charmides. Charmides was a Democrat and a good friend of Socrates. So at the worst you can say about Socrates is that he had friends on both sides of the aisle. I don't think he was rigidly kind of fascist or anything. That seems very unlikely to me. Also, I think it was after I should look up this story, but I think after the democracy was reinstated, they were mad at the generals that had done something, and Socrates was directed to go find them. So he was had some political. I should look this up. But
he was supposed to arrest somebody, but I think that was the 30 tyrants that told him to arrest somebody.
Okay, well, that's the question. He wouldn't do it, though.
No, he wouldn't do it, and the 30 tyrants were unpopular. So that action would, if anything, influence the jury in favor of Socrates.
Right.
Simply that he talked to these guys was enough once the hysteria got to that pitch.
Right. And here's one other thing that may have influenced Plato and his idea about democracy is that he was a teenager when Athens decided to invade Syracuse. And I found that I compare this to Japan hitting Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto knew that, if they didn't knock the United States out in that one blow, they were in for some deep shit, because Yamamoto knew enough about the United States to know these guys are not to be messed with. And he turned out to be right. And by the way, we assassinated him. And there's something very similar about a guy named Nicias, who was a general in Greece who was opposed to invading Syracuse. But the hotheads in the assembly convinced everybody that this is what they should do. So Athens did, in fact, invade Syracuse, and they were, in fact, defeated. And I think Nicias was killed. Kind of two interesting parallels in history. But Plato would have seen this happen, like the democracy getting all pumped up and saying, we're going to go invade something that was obviously a foolish thing. And so he was impressed by the fact that crowds could be swayed to do things that were unwise. That's why he had this idea of the guardians. The guardians are kind of perfect, they're wise and they're not going to make stupid mistakes like that. Anybody else? Some of you came in late. A couple of things I mentioned was next time PG&E on Thursday is cutting out my electricity, but I still think I have a generator and I think I can make it work unless they take the cable down too, which I don't know whether they're going to do or not. If they take the cable down, I'll try to do this by my phone, but I'm not sure how that's going to work. So if you don't see me on Thursday at 10 o'clock, that's what's going on.